I'm Julia Hendrick, and I went from aging out of foster care to commanding the mission you saw on national TV. For years, I sent money, showed up, and kept bridges alive for people who rarely met me halfway. But when my family skipped my commissioning and got together without me, I drew a line and everything changed. Ever been undervalued by the very people you carried? Tell me in the comments. You're not the only one. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and taking your power back. What happened next might surprise you. I was 8 when they divided us up like furniture in a divorce. Mom packed Jennifer's things first, folding her clothes with the same care she'd once used for all of us. Dad loaded Michael's baseball glove and comic books into his pickup truck, ruffling his hair the way he used to ruffle mine. They spoke in hushed tones about custody arrangements and living situations, their voices carrying the weight of decisions already made. Neither of them packed my things. "It's temporary," Mom said, avoiding my eyes as the social worker explained foster care procedures. "Just until we get settled." Dad nodded along, checking his watch. They both had somewhere else to be, someone else to focus on. The social worker's hand felt foreign on my shoulder as we watched their cars pull away in opposite directions, my siblings waving from rear windows that grew smaller until they disappeared entirely. The Hendersons were my first placement. Clean house, strict rules, rotating chores posted on a laminated chart. Mrs. Henderson explained their system with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Breakfast at 7, lights out at 9. No phone calls after 8 p.m. I learned to navigate their routine quickly, understanding instinctively that compliance meant stability, and stability was all I had. Foster care operates on a different rhythm than family life. Everything feels borrowed: the bed, the dresser, the place at the dinner table. You don't unpack completely because you might need to leave. You don't get attached to bedtime stories or Saturday morning cartoons because those privileges can disappear with the next placement. You learn to carry what matters in a single backpack, ready to move when the adults decide it's time. But I still wrote letters. Every week, I'd sit at the Hendersons' kitchen table with notebook paper and a pencil, writing to Jennifer and Michael. I told them about school, about the other kids in the house, about the dog next door who barked at squirrels. I sent birthday cards bought with my allowance money, carefully selecting ones that seemed appropriate for siblings I was slowly growing apart from. The return letters came sporadically, Jennifer's filled with details about dance classes and new friends, Michael's shorter, usually asking for help with homework I couldn't remember how to do. The photos hurt the most. Mom would send updates every few months, Jennifer at a school play, Michael at a baseball game, family barbecues where they looked settled and happy. I'd study these images, searching for some sign that I was missed, some empty space where I should have been standing. Instead, I saw completion. They looked like a family without me. At the Hendersons, I shared a room with Kayla, another foster kid who'd been there 2 years. She taught me the unspoken rules. Don't mention your real family too much. Don't complain about the food. Always say thank you. They're good people, she'd whisper after lights out, but we're not their kids. Remember that. I tried to, but part of me kept hoping someone would claim me permanently, that the temporary arrangement would resolve itself in my favor. Christmas was the hardest. Mom would call on Christmas morning, putting Jennifer on the phone first. "We got so many presents," she'd say, her voice bright with excitement. "Mom got me a bike, and we're going to Grandma's for dinner." Michael would grab the phone next, telling me about video games and the fort he was building in Dad's backyard. When they passed the phone back to Mom, she'd ask how I was doing, but I could hear dishes clattering in the background, other conversations pulling her attention away. The Hendersons tried their best with holidays. They bought gifts for all the foster kids, wrapped in cheerful paper with tags that read, "From Santa." But their effort only highlighted what I didn't have: parents who remembered exactly what I'd wanted, siblings who fought over who got to give me their gift first, a grandmother's house that smelled like cinnamon and expected my presence. By 10, I'd stopped expecting visits. By 12, I understood that temporary had become permanent without anyone officially acknowledging the change. My siblings had new routines, new inside jokes, new memories that didn't include me. They'd adapted to their divided family structure while I remained the leftover piece, the one who didn't fit anywhere. The Hendersons were patient with my questions about why my parents couldn't take me to, why the arrangement had to be permanent, why family court had decided I belonged somewhere else. They explained adult complexities in child-appropriate language, but the truth was simpler and more painful. My parents had made their choices, and those choices hadn't included me. Still, I kept trying. When I got my first job at 15, stocking shelves at a grocery store after school, I sent money for Jennifer's dance costume and Michael's baseball cleats. When they graduated from elementary school, I bought cards and gift certificates, mailing them from whatever placement I was living in at the time. I attended their school events when I could manage transportation, sitting in bleachers next to other families, clapping alone. The effort felt necessary, like breathing. These were my people, even if I wasn't theirs. Every birthday card I sent, every phone call I initiated, every small gift I could afford was my way of maintaining the connection they seemed increasingly willing to let fade. I told myself that consistency mattered, that love was measured in accumulated small gestures, that eventually they'd see how much I'd invested in keeping us together. What I didn't understand then was that love isn't measured in effort when that effort isn't reciprocated. I was building a bridge that only I was walking across, maintaining relationships that existed primarily in my own mind. They'd moved on, created new definitions of family that worked for their circumstances. I was still holding on to something that had ended years earlier, when they drove away in separate cars and left me standing with a social worker who wasn't equipped to fill the space they'd vacated. The realization would come later, in sharp moments of clarity that cut through years of wishful thinking. But during those foster care years, I simply held on, believing that persistence would eventually be rewarded with the inclusion I'd always craved. I turned 17 in the Martinez placement, my sixth home in 9 years. Mrs. Martinez baked a cake and invited the other kids to sing, but the celebration felt hollow. That night, Jennifer called to apologize for forgetting again. Her voice rushed as she explained about prom planning and college applications. Michael didn't call at all. The pattern had become clear, but I wasn't ready to see it yet. The shift started subtly, the way most betrayals do. When I called Jennifer to tell her about making honor roll, she'd cut the conversation short because she was meeting friends at the mall. When I asked Michael about his baseball season, he'd give one-word answers before handing the phone back to Dad. Their lives had texture and detail, but those details rarely included space for me. At 18, I aged out of foster care with a high school diploma and a small savings account from my grocery store job. The transition coordinator helped me find a studio apartment and apply for community college, but the emotional preparation was something I had to navigate alone. Other kids had parents to call when the washing machine broke or when they needed advice about job interviews. I had phone numbers that increasingly went straight to voicemail. College was the first time I felt like I belonged somewhere. My professors didn't know about my foster care background unless I chose to share it. My classmates treated me based on my performance, not my history. I discovered I was good at logistics, at organizing complex systems, at leading group projects where everyone contributed equally. The structure appealed to me: clear expectations, measurable results, merit-based advancement. Jennifer was a sophomore at a state school 3 hours away, studying communications. When I called to tell her about making Dean's List, she spent most of the conversation complaining about her roommate and asking if I could loan her money for spring break. Michael was a senior in high school, focused on getting recruited for college baseball. Dad posted updates about his games on social media, but I learned about Michael's statistics from Facebook rather than direct communication. The requests started around then. Jennifer needed help with a security deposit because Mom was tight on money. Michael wanted me to write a character reference for a college application because I was good at that kind of thing. Dad asked if I knew anyone who could help him get a better rate on car insurance. Each request came with casual assumption that I'd comply, that helping them was part of my role in their lives. But when I invited them to my community college graduation, their responses revealed the actual hierarchy. Mom said she'd try to make it, but couldn't promise anything because Jennifer had a dance recital the same weekend. Dad said he was proud of me but couldn't get time off work. Michael didn't respond to the invitation at all. Jennifer sent a congratulations text 2 days after the ceremony, adding that she'd love to see pictures. I sat in the auditorium surrounded by other graduates and their families, listening to my name called with no one in the audience to cheer. The woman next to me had 3 generations present, grandparents holding balloons, parents taking pictures, siblings whooping from the back row. I applauded for strangers' accomplishments while my own passed without witness. After the ceremony, I drove to a restaurant alone and ordered dinner, trying to convince myself that independence was more valuable than support. The waitress asked if I was celebrating something special, and I told her about graduating. She brought a free dessert with a candle stuck in the middle, singing Happy Graduation in broken English. Her kindness made me cry more than my family's absence had. That night, I found the Facebook photos. Jennifer's dance recital had been the previous weekend, not the same as my graduation. The pictures showed Mom and Dad sitting together in the audience, applauding for their daughter with the kind of attention they'd never focused on me. They'd lied about the conflict, chosen her event over mine without even acknowledging the choice. The realization settled slowly, like sediment in still water. They'd always seen me as peripheral, but I'd assumed that perspective would change as I proved my worth through achievements. Instead, my accomplishments seemed to make them more distant, as if my success highlighted something uncomfortable about the family structure they'd created. I began paying attention differently, noticing patterns I'd previously excused. When they called, it was always to ask for something. When I called them, conversations felt hurried, distracted. When they posted family photos, I was never mentioned as absent. They'd simply edited their narrative to exclude me so completely that my presence wasn't even notable by its absence. The officer training program gave me structure and purpose that felt more solid than anything I'd experienced. Physical demands, academic requirements, leadership challenges, all of it made sense in ways that family dynamics never had. My fellow cadets came from various backgrounds, but we were evaluated on identical standards. Merit mattered more than history. Jennifer visited campus once during my training, driving through with college friends who wanted to see a military academy. She took pictures with me in uniform, posting them online with captions about her hero sister, but left after an hour because they had dinner plans elsewhere. She didn't ask about my studies or my goals. She treated the visit like tourist attraction rather than family connection. Michael never visited at all, though he lived only 90 minutes away. When I called to invite him, he said he was too busy with baseball season, then posted pictures the same weekend of a camping trip with friends. The message was clear: visiting me wasn't a priority worth rearranging other plans. The training culminated in a commissioning ceremony where new officers received their first assignments. Parents and families filled the auditorium, creating a sea of proud faces and camera flashes. I'd sent formal invitations weeks in advance, included parking information and hotel recommendations, even offered to pay for their travel expenses. Mom called the day before to cancel. Jennifer had a sorority event that couldn't be missed. Dad texted that morning to say he couldn't get coverage at work. Michael didn't acknowledge the invitation at all. I pinned my new lieutenant's bars on my own shoulders while families around me created memories they'd treasure forever. But the real betrayal was still coming. 2 days later, Jennifer posted pictures from the weekend. A family barbecue at Dad's house, complete with grandparents, cousins, and extended family I rarely saw anymore. Mom was there too, laughing at Dad's grill, the divorce animosity apparently suspended for this gathering. Michael wore his baseball uniform, having come straight from a game. Everyone looked relaxed and happy, celebrating something I couldn't identify from the photos. The timestamp showed they'd all been together during my commissioning ceremony, not at the conflicting events they'd claimed prevented their attendance. They'd chosen each other over me, then lied about the choice to avoid acknowledging what it meant. I stared at those pictures for a long time, finally understanding something I'd been too hopeful to see clearly. This wasn't about busy schedules or competing priorities. This was about belonging, and I simply didn't belong in their version of family. I was useful when they needed something, forgotten when they didn't, and consistently excluded from the moments that mattered to them. The pain was sharp and clean, like a bone breaking. But underneath it was something unexpected, relief. I finally had clarity about where I stood. I spent that evening in my quarters, looking at photos from my own ceremony, pictures other cadets had taken, professional shots from the academy photographer, images that documented my achievement without requiring family presence to validate it. The uniform fit perfectly. The rank was earned. The accomplishment belonged entirely to me. For the first time in my adult life, I stopped trying to force my way into spaces where I wasn't wanted. I stopped making excuses for their absence, stopped minimizing their neglect, stopped pretending that effort on my part would eventually be matched by acceptance on theirs. The next morning, I began my career as a commissioned officer, carrying nothing from my past except the lessons it had taught me about resilience and self-reliance. They'd given me something valuable after all, though not what they'd intended, the knowledge that I could succeed without their approval, build a life without their participation, and create meaning that didn't depend on their recognition. I didn't call them. For the first time in my life, I had nothing more to prove. The silence lasted 3 months. During that time, I completed advanced training, received my first assignment, and moved to a base across the country. I didn't send change of address cards or update them about my location. When Jennifer called, I let it go to voicemail. When Dad texted asking about my new assignment, I didn't respond. When Michael's graduation announcement arrived in the mail, I threw it away without opening it. The break felt clean and necessary, like setting a broken bone. Everything I'd been carrying, the constant effort to maintain connection, the emotional labor of being family to people who didn't consider me family, the hope that persistence would eventually be rewarded, all of it stopped. I discovered how much energy I'd been spending on relationships that only existed in my imagination. My commanding officer noticed the change. "You seem different, Lieutenant. More focused." He was right. Without the constant background static of family drama, I could concentrate fully on my work. My performance evaluations improved. I volunteered for additional responsibilities. I began building relationships with people who valued my presence rather than took it for granted. The first real test came when Jennifer called crying. She'd failed 2 classes and was in danger of losing her scholarship. Mom couldn't help with tuition, and Dad was dealing with his own financial problems. She needed a loan, something substantial enough to cover a full semester. "You're the only one who's good with money," she said. "I promise I'll pay you back." The old version of me would have transferred money immediately, grateful for any opportunity to demonstrate my usefulness to the family. The new version sat quietly while she explained her situation, then said something that surprised us both. "I'm sorry that happened to you, but I can't help." "What do you mean you can't help?" "You have money." "I mean I won't help." "There's a difference." The conversation deteriorated quickly. She accused me of being bitter about the commissioning ceremony, claimed I was punishing the whole family for her mother's decisions, said I was turning into someone cold and unrecognizable. When emotional manipulation didn't work, she got angry. "Fine. Don't help your own sister. But don't come crying to us when you need something." I almost laughed at the irony. When had I ever been able to depend on them for anything? Michael's call came a week later. He needed a character reference for a job application, something from a military officer to strengthen his credentials. The request was casual, assuming I'd comply without question. When I declined, his surprise was genuine. "But it would only take you like 10 minutes. Then ask someone else." "I don't know any other officers." "That's not my problem." These conversations were painful but clarifying. They'd never questioned their right to my assistance, never considered what they offered in return, never evaluated whether their treatment of me warranted continued support. My value to them had always been utilitarian, what I could provide, not who I was. Dad was the last to reach out, months after the others had tried and failed to guilt me into compliance. His approach was different, more strategic. He started with small talk about my career, expressed pride in my achievements, asked genuine questions about military life. When he finally made his request, help with a business loan application that required a military reference, the buildup felt calculated rather than sincere. "I'm not comfortable with that," I said. "Not comfortable? I'm your father. Are you?" The question hung between us, heavier than I'd intended. He'd been my biological father, but the role had ended when he chose Michael over me, when he left me in foster care while building a life that didn't include space for his other daughter. "That's not fair," he said finally. "Nothing about this has been fair. But I'm done pretending otherwise." The calls stopped after that. No more requests, no more guilt trips, no more casual assumptions that I'd be available whenever they needed something. The silence felt like success, though it took me months to stop bracing for the phone to ring. I began to understand what healthy relationships looked like by contrast. My fellow officers checked on each other without wanting anything in return. They celebrated each other's promotions, offered help during difficult assignments, created support systems based on mutual respect. These relationships required effort from everyone involved, not just one person carrying the emotional weight of connection. During this period, I was assigned to a disaster relief operation after a major hurricane. My job was coordinating supply distribution to affected communities, managing logistics for an operation that served thousands of people daily. The work was demanding but rewarding, requiring skills I developed through years of making things work with limited resources. The assignment lasted 8 months and earned commendations from multiple commanding officers. When I returned to base, I found a stack of messages from journalists wanting to interview me about the operation's success. A documentary crew had filmed parts of our relief effort, and their footage had caught attention from military leadership and civilian media. I declined most interview requests, but agreed to speak with one reporter who was writing about innovative approaches to disaster management. The article was technical, focused on logistics and coordination strategies, but it mentioned my background briefly. Lieutenant Julia Hendrick, who spent her childhood in foster care, has developed approaches to resource management that reflect both efficiency and empathy. That article was republished in military journals and civilian magazines. Other reporters began calling, interested in the human interest angle of my story. I continued declining interviews, but my name began appearing in professional circles as someone worth watching. The breakthrough came 2 years later, during a deployment to a region affected by both natural disaster and military conflict. Civilian populations were trapped between environmental damage and active combat zones. Traditional evacuation routes were blocked, supply lines were compromised, and coordination between military and civilian agencies was breaking down. My commanding officer assigned me to lead a joint task force responsible for evacuating approximately 800 civilians from a disaster zone while navigating active military operations. The situation required real-time decision-making, creative problem-solving, and the ability to coordinate multiple agencies under extreme pressure. The operation succeeded, but barely. We evacuated all civilians without casualties, established functional supply lines, and created a model for coordination that was later adopted as standard protocol. The success was documented by embedded journalists and military historians who were studying contemporary disaster response strategies. When the footage aired on national television, I was identified as the operation commander who designed and executed the evacuation plan. The coverage was extensive, including interviews with rescued civilians who credited my leadership with saving their lives. Military analysts described the operation as a textbook example of innovative command structure under impossible conditions. That night, my phone started ringing. I was in my quarters, exhausted from months of deployment, trying to process the day's final reports when the calls began. The first few were from military colleagues and supervisors offering congratulations. Then came calls from numbers I didn't recognize, journalists, documentary producers, military historians wanting interviews. And then came the calls from numbers I did recognize. Jennifer called first, her voice bright with excitement. "Julia, we saw you on TV. Mom and I were watching together, and we couldn't believe it when they said your name. You looked so professional, so in control. We're so proud of you." I let the call go to voicemail and listened to her message later. She talked for 3 minutes about seeing me on television, about how she'd called all her friends to tell them her sister was a war hero, about how she'd recorded the segment to show people. She mentioned wanting to visit, catching up, being part of my success story. She didn't mention the years of silence, the refused requests for help, The way she'd treated me like an inconvenience rather than family. In her narrative, we'd simply been out of touch, and now we could reconnect based on my newfound prominence. Michael's call came 20 minutes later. His message was shorter, but equally revisionist. "Hey Julia, saw the news coverage. Pretty amazing stuff. Dad and I were talking about how we always knew you'd do something important. Give me a call when you get a chance." Dad called twice, leaving increasingly detailed messages about how proud he was, how he'd been following my career, how he'd always believed in my potential. Mom left 4 messages, each one more emotional than the last, talking about watching the coverage with tears in her eyes, about how she'd never doubted I'd make something special of my life. By morning, I had 58 missed calls from family members, extended relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, and people claiming connection to my success story. The voicemails painted a picture of a supportive family who'd been quietly cheering for me all along, who'd simply been respecting my space while I built my career. None of it was true, but the lies were so consistent that they almost felt believable. I listened to every message, sitting in my quarters with a cup of coffee, trying to reconcile these voices with the reality of our actual relationship. They spoke as if the years of neglect had never happened, as if my achievements reflected well on them, as if they'd earned the right to share in my moment of recognition. The knock came that afternoon, while I was reviewing deployment reports and trying to decide how to handle the media attention. Sharp, authoritative, the kind of knock that demanded response. I looked through the window and saw Dad standing at my door, still wearing his work clothes, like he'd driven straight from his job to my base. Behind him, in a car parked at the curb, I could see Mom in the passenger seat and Jennifer in the back. Michael wasn't visible, but I assumed he was there too. They'd coordinated this visit, driven several hours to show up unannounced at my quarters, ready to insert themselves into my success story. I stood at the door for a long time, key in my hand, listening to Dad knock again. Through the window, I could see him checking his watch, adjusting his shirt, preparing for a conversation he assumed would go well. Mom was reapplying lipstick in the car's side mirror. Jennifer was checking her phone. They looked exactly like what they were, people who'd ignored me for years until ignoring me became inconvenient, who'd written me out of their family story until my story became valuable enough to want back in. I had choices. I could open the door and let them explain themselves, listen to their apologies and justifications, allow them to rewrite history in ways that made them feel better about their behavior. I could be gracious and forgiving, the bigger person who welcomed them back despite their treatment of me. I could pretend that their sudden interest in my life was genuine rather than opportunistic. Or I could acknowledge what I'd learned about myself during the years of silence, that I was stronger without their approval, more successful without their support, happier without their drama. That family was something you built through consistent love and mutual respect, not something you inherited through biology and maintained through obligation. The knock came a third time, more insistent now. Dad was probably wondering why I wasn't answering, whether I was actually home, whether their surprise visit was working as planned. I looked around my quarters, clean, organized, filled with evidence of a life I'd built entirely on my own terms. Commendations on the walls, photos with my unit, books about military strategy and disaster management. Everything in this space represented choices I'd made without their input, success I'd achieved without their assistance, relationships I'd formed based on mutual respect rather than biological accident. They'd taught me something valuable during those years of abandonment, something they'd never intended to teach, that love isn't something you can demand or assume or inherit. It's something you earn through consistency, demonstrate through presence, maintain through reciprocity. They'd never offered me any of those things, but they'd shown me how to recognize them when they appeared in my life through other relationships. The knocking stopped. Through the window, I watched Dad walk back to the car, his shoulders set in frustration. They sat there for another 10 minutes, probably debating whether to try again, whether to wait longer, whether to leave a note. Eventually, the car pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the base road. I made coffee and returned to my reports, feeling something I'd rarely experienced in relation to my family: peace. They would probably try again, find other ways to reach me, other angles to approach the relationship they suddenly wanted to claim. But I'd finally learned something they'd been inadvertently teaching me for years, that I didn't need their permission to be successful, their presence to be complete, or their approval to be valuable. The phone started ringing again as evening approached, but I'd already turned off the sound. Tomorrow, I would deal with journalists and interviews and the professional obligations that came with public recognition. Tonight, I would enjoy the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived on my own terms. Outside my window, the base was settling into evening routines. Soldiers were heading to mess halls, completing final duties, checking in with each other after a long day. These were my people now, not because of blood or biology, but because of shared values and mutual respect. We'd chosen each other through consistent actions rather than inherited each other through family accident. The documentary about our disaster relief operation aired 6 months later, winning awards and creating additional opportunities for the unit members who'd participated. I was promoted ahead of schedule and offered positions with increased responsibility. Speaking invitations came from military academies and disaster management conferences. My career trajectory had shifted dramatically, opening doors I'd never expected to walk through. The family calls continued sporadically, triggered by each new mention of my name in professional contexts. Jennifer left messages about wanting to visit, to introduce me to her fiancé, to include me in wedding planning. Michael called when he was considering military service himself, asking for advice about officer training programs. Dad tried different approaches: proud father, concerned parent, regretful man seeking reconciliation. Mom's messages were the most persistent and the most manipulative. She spoke about missing me, about regretting past decisions, about wanting to rebuild our relationship before it was too late. She mentioned getting older, facing health concerns, needing her daughter in her life. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated but transparent, designed to trigger guilt and obligation rather than genuine connection. I listened to all of their messages, but responded to none of them. Each voicemail confirmed my decision to maintain distance, revealing that their interest in reconciliation was still fundamentally self-serving. They wanted access to my success, connection to my achievements, association with my reputation. They didn't want me, they wanted what I represented. The clearest evidence came when Jennifer got engaged. The wedding invitation arrived with a personal note expressing hope that I'd be part of her special day, that we could use the occasion to rebuild our family relationships, that my presence would mean everything to her. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in June, black tie optional, ceremony and reception at an upscale venue. I almost went. Despite everything, part of me still craved the normalcy of family celebrations, the possibility that shared joy could bridge the gap between us. I requested leave, bought an appropriate dress, booked a hotel room near the venue. As the date approached, I imagined what it might feel like to be included, to be welcomed, to be part of something that mattered to them. 2 weeks before the wedding, I found the social media posts. Jennifer had been documenting her wedding planning extensively, sharing photos of dress fittings and cake tastings and flower arrangements. Her posts about the wedding party were particularly detailed, introducing each bridesmaid with long captions about their friendship and importance in her life. I wasn't a bridesmaid. That wasn't surprising. We hadn't been close enough for me to expect that role. But I also wasn't mentioned anywhere in her wedding content. When friends commented asking about her family, she talked about Mom's involvement in planning and Dad's pride in walking her down the aisle. When people asked about siblings, she mentioned Michael's role as an usher. She'd invited me as a guest, not as family. The invitation was a gesture, not a genuine inclusion. I would sit in the back with distant relatives and family friends, watching a celebration that positioned me as peripheral rather than essential. The wedding would be another performance of their family narrative, with my presence providing cover for their treatment of me without requiring actual acceptance of me. I canceled my hotel reservation and returned the dress. Instead of attending the wedding, I spent that weekend leading a training exercise for junior officers, teaching the kinds of leadership skills I developed through years of navigating situations where I couldn't rely on anyone else. The absence was noted. Jennifer called afterward, hurt and confused by my decision not to attend. She'd saved me a seat, she said, right up front with the family. She'd told people I was coming, had been looking forward to introducing me to her new husband's family, had hoped the wedding would mark a new beginning for our relationship. "Why didn't you come?" she asked, and I could hear genuine bewilderment in her voice. "Because I'm not part of your family," I said. "I'm someone you invite when it looks good to include me." "That's not true. You're my sister." "Am I? When was the last time you called when you didn't need something? When was the last time you included me in plans that weren't about performing family unity for other people?" The question hung between us, unanswerable because we both knew the truth. I was her sister when it was convenient, absent when it wasn't, welcome when my presence served their narrative about being a close family. After that conversation, the calls became less frequent. They'd tested whether my success had made me more willing to accept their terms for relationship, and my continued boundaries had clarified that nothing fundamental had changed. I was still the same person who'd set limits on their behavior, still unwilling to accept scraps of attention in exchange for unlimited availability. Years passed quietly. I was promoted to major, then lieutenant colonel, taking on increasingly complex assignments that utilized my skills in crisis management and organizational leadership. My work was recognized within military circles and civilian disaster management communities. I built mentoring relationships with younger officers, sharing the kind of guidance I'd never received about navigating professional challenges and personal boundaries. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday in November. I was in my office reviewing budget proposals when my assistant knocked to say I had an urgent call from a hospital in my hometown. My first thought was that someone had used me as an emergency contact by mistake, but the caller identified herself as a social worker trying to locate family members for Jennifer Hendrick. Jennifer had been in a car accident, she explained. Nothing life-threatening, but she'd been hospitalized overnight for observation and needed someone to make medical decisions if she became incapacitated. Mom was listed as emergency contact, but they couldn't reach her. Dad's number was disconnected. Michael's phone went straight to voicemail. I was the only family member they'd been able to locate. "Are you able to come?" the social worker asked. I stared at my computer screen, processing the request. Jennifer was hurt and alone, with no one from her family available to help. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of being treated as peripheral, I was the only one they could find in an emergency. "I'm several states away," I said. "I couldn't get there for hours. She's stable now, but we need someone who can make decisions if her condition changes. Are you willing to be listed as her emergency contact?" The question required a choice that went beyond logistics. Taking responsibility for Jennifer's medical care meant accepting a role in her life that she'd never offered me, stepping into a family function that had been denied to me when I'd wanted it. But it also meant being the person I'd wanted them to be, someone who showed up when needed, who took care of family regardless of how that care had been reciprocated, who defined relationship through actions rather than convenience. I drove 6 hours that night, arriving at the hospital as morning shift nurses were starting their rounds. Jennifer was awake and alert, her injuries minor, but requiring continued monitoring. She looked surprised to see me, then immediately burst into tears. "You came," she said, and the relief in her voice was unmistakable. "Of course I came." We talked quietly while she waited for discharge paperwork. She told me about the accident, about how scary it had been to wake up alone in the hospital, about how frustrated she'd felt when no one answered their phones. She'd been trying to reach Mom for days about other things, but calls kept going unanswered. Dad's phone had been disconnected months ago due to unpaid bills. Michael was deployed overseas with his National Guard unit and couldn't be reached immediately. "I didn't know you were still in the military," she said. "Lieutenant Colonel now." "That's really good, right?" "High ranking." "High enough." She was quiet for a while, looking uncomfortable. Finally, she asked the question I'd been expecting. "Why did you come? After everything that's happened between us?" I'd been thinking about that during the long drive, trying to understand my own motivations. Part of it was simple human decency. She was hurt and alone, and I was capable of helping. Part of it was the military training that taught you to respond to emergencies regardless of personal feelings. But part of it was something more complex. "Because this is who I want to be," I said. Someone who shows up. Even for people who haven't shown up for you? Especially then. She was released that afternoon with instructions for follow-up care and pain management. I drove her to her apartment, helped her get settled, made sure she had groceries and medication. When she asked if I could stay longer, I explained that I needed to get back to base, but would check in by phone over the next few days. Julia, she said as I was leaving, I know I haven't been a good sister. No, I agreed, you haven't. The honesty seemed to surprise her, but also relieve her. We'd both been carrying the weight of unacknowledged truth for years. I don't know how to fix it, she said. Maybe start by not needing anything from me, I said. Call because you want to talk, not because you want something. Include me in things because you enjoy my company, not because it looks good. Treat me like someone whose presence matters, not someone whose absence doesn't. She nodded, tears starting again. I can try to do that. We'll see, I said, not unkindly but without false optimism. The drive back to base gave me time to process what had happened. I'd crossed a line I'd maintained for years, engaging with family drama I'd worked hard to avoid. But the engagement had been on my terms, motivated by my values rather than their demands. I'd helped because helping felt right, not because I owed them anything or hoped for reciprocity. Jennifer did call the next week, just to check in, no requests or favors needed. The conversation was awkward at first. We were out of practice at talking without agenda, but it felt different from our previous interactions. She asked about my work without trying to use the information for her own benefit. She told me about her recovery without dramatizing it for sympathy. It wasn't reconciliation, exactly, but it was a beginning of something more honest than what we'd had before. The real test came months later when Mom called. Her voice was shakier than I remembered, aged by years and circumstances I knew nothing about. She'd gotten my number from Jennifer, she explained, and hoped it was okay to reach out directly. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time, she said. About everything that happened when you were younger. About the choices your father and I made. I waited, curious to hear what explanation she'd constructed, what narrative would make her feel better about the past. We were so young when we divorced, she continued. So overwhelmed by trying to figure out our own lives. The custody arrangements seemed like the best solution at the time, but we didn't think about how it would affect you long term. The explanation was careful, designed to frame their decisions as mistakes rather than choices, circumstances rather than character. She spoke about being overwhelmed rather than selfish, about making difficult decisions rather than abandoning responsibility. I know we failed you, she said finally. I know we weren't the parents you deserved. But I hope it's not too late to try to be family again. What does that mean to you? I asked. Being family? Spending time together. Getting to know each other as adults. Being part of each other's lives. And what would you bring to that relationship? The questions seemed to confuse her. What do you mean? I mean, what would you contribute? What would make a relationship with you valuable to me? I'm your mother. That's biology, not relationship. What would you offer besides shared DNA? She was quiet for a long time, and I could hear her struggling with a question she'd probably never considered. In her mind, being my mother was sufficient justification for access to my life, regardless of how she'd used that access in the past. I love you, she said finally. Do you? Or do you love the idea of having a successful daughter you can point to as evidence that you weren't a complete failure as a parent? That's not fair. Neither was leaving me in foster care while you built lives with my siblings. The conversation ended without resolution, but it clarified something important for both of us. She wanted redemption without accountability, relationship without responsibility. I wanted consistency and reciprocity, things she'd never learned to provide. Over the following years, I maintained limited contact with Jennifer while keeping clear boundaries with the rest of the family. Jennifer's attempts at relationship were imperfect but genuine. She called regularly without needing favors, included me in occasional family updates, acknowledged important dates without making demands. The effort wasn't consistent enough to rebuild trust completely, but it was different enough to merit continued engagement. Michael reached out eventually, motivated by his own military experience and curiosity about my career. Our conversations were professional rather than personal, focused on shared understanding of military life rather than family dynamics. We developed a cordial relationship based on mutual respect for each other's service, though we never addressed the underlying issues that had divided us. Mom and Dad continued their separate attempts at reconciliation, but neither was willing to engage with the reality of their behavior or the impact it had on me. They wanted forgiveness without repentance, relationship without acknowledgement of harm caused. I stopped taking their calls after repeated conversations that followed the same pattern of guilt-tripping and emotional manipulation. The distance wasn't punishment, it was protection. I'd learned to recognize relationships that depleted rather than sustained me, people who took more than they gave, dynamics that required me to diminish myself for others to feel comfortable. Family biology didn't exempt people from those standards. My career continued advancing, bringing opportunities for leadership at national and international levels. I commanded units during natural disasters, coordinated relief efforts during humanitarian crises, developed protocols that were adopted across multiple agencies. The work was demanding but fulfilling, utilizing skills I developed through years of making things work under difficult circumstances. Recognition followed naturally: promotions, commendations, speaking engagements, consulting opportunities. Military journals published articles about my approaches to crisis management. Civilian organizations invited me to advise on emergency preparedness. Universities offered teaching positions for when I eventually retired from active duty. Success felt different than I'd expected during those foster care years when I'd imagined achievement as a way to earn family acceptance. Instead of validating relationships that had always been conditional, success had freed me from needing validation at all. I'd built a life that satisfied me regardless of who approved or disappeared. The final conversation with Dad came 5 years after that hospital visit with Jennifer. He called on a Sunday evening while I was reading, his voice heavy with something that sounded like genuine remorse. "I've been thinking a lot about when you were younger," he said. "About the decisions your mother and I made. About how we handled things. Okay, I want you to know that I regret how it all worked out. I wish we'd found a way to keep the family together." "You did keep the family together," I said. "Just not the whole family." "That's not how we saw it at the time." "How did you see it?" "Like we were doing the best we could with an impossible situation." "Nothing was impossible about it. You chose Michael over me. Mom chose Jennifer over me. Those were choices, not circumstances." "It wasn't that simple." "It was exactly that simple. You had 3 children and you kept 2 of them." He was quiet for a long time, and I wondered if he'd finally heard what I'd been trying to tell him for years. When he spoke again, his voice was different. "You're right," he said. "We chose. And we chose wrong." The admission was startling in its directness. No excuses, no justifications, no attempts to minimize the impact of their decisions. Just acknowledgement of choices made and their consequences. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I'm getting older and I can't pretend anymore that we did the right thing. Because you turned out better than any of us and it wasn't because of anything we did for you. Because I want you to know that I know we failed you." "And what am I supposed to do with that information?" "Nothing, I guess. I just needed you to know that I see it clearly now." "Too late to matter," I said, but without the anger that would have accompanied those words years earlier. "I know," he said. "But I needed to say it anyway." After he hung up, I sat in my living room thinking about forgiveness and accountability, about the difference between understanding someone's limitations and accepting their behavior. Dad's acknowledgement didn't change the past or repair the damage, but it marked the first time any of them had taken full responsibility for their choices. It wasn't enough to rebuild relationship, but it was enough to provide closure. 10 years passed. I retired from active duty as a full colonel, transitioning to consulting work with disaster management organizations and military training facilities. The work kept me connected to causes I cared about while providing flexibility to choose assignments that interested me. Jennifer and I maintained a regular but genuine contact. She'd married, had children, built a stable life that seemed to satisfy her. When she invited me to her son's baptism, I attended not as an obligatory family gesture, but because I wanted to meet the next generation and see how she'd evolved as a person. The gathering was small, mostly her husband's family and a few close friends. Mom was there, older and frielier than I'd expected, but she kept our interaction polite and brief. Michael attended with his wife and daughter, and we had a pleasant conversation about his work in emergency management, a career choice clearly influenced by his military experience. Dad wasn't there. Jennifer mentioned quietly that his health had been declining and he didn't travel much anymore. I felt a flicker of something that might have been concern, but it passed quickly. We'd said everything that needed saying during that final phone call. Watching Jennifer with her children was revealing. She was attentive and present in ways I remembered Mom being during our earliest years, before the divorce and custody arrangements changed everything. Her son clung to her during the ceremony, clearly secure in their attachment. Her attention focused entirely on him during the important moments, creating memories he'd carry forward. "You're a good mother," I told her afterward. "I try to be," she said. "I think about you sometimes, about what it must have been like for you when we all scattered. I want to make sure my kids never doubt that they're wanted." "They won't," I said, watching her son play with his cousins. "You can tell when kids feel secure." "I hope so. I want to be better than we were." "You already are." The drive home from the baptism gave me time to reflect on how much had changed since those early years when I desperately wanted inclusion in their family celebrations. I'd attended this event as myself, successful, independent, secure in my own identity, rather than as someone hoping for acceptance or validation. The difference was profound. I no longer needed their approval to feel valuable, their inclusion to feel complete, their recognition to feel successful. The relationships I maintained with them were voluntary rather than obligatory, based on present reality rather than past hope. That evening, I looked through photo albums from my military career, remembering the people who'd actually been present during important moments. My commissioning ceremony had been attended by my training cohort and commanding officers who'd invested in my development. My promotion ceremonies had been witnessed by colleagues who'd worked alongside me during challenging assignments. My retirement ceremony had been organized by junior officers I'd mentored, people whose careers I'd helped advance. These were my people, chosen rather than inherited, earned rather than assumed, maintained through mutual investment rather than biological accident. They'd celebrated my successes because they'd contributed to them, supported me during difficulties because they'd shared them, remained present during ordinary moments because they valued my company. The family I'd created through consistent choice and reciprocal care was more substantial than the one I'd inherited through biology and maintained through obligation. Understanding that difference had been the key to building a life that satisfied me completely. 6 months later, Jennifer called to tell me that Dad had died. "Heart attack, quick and relatively peaceful," she said. The funeral would be small, just immediate family and a few close friends. She wanted me to know in case I wanted to attend, but she understood if I chose not to. I thought about it for several days, trying to determine what felt right rather than what looked appropriate. Dad and I had achieved something like understanding during our final conversation, but our relationship had never progressed beyond that acknowledgement. He'd remained a stranger who'd contributed to my genetics, but not my development. In the end, I sent flowers with a card expressing sympathy for Jennifer's loss, but I didn't attend the service. My presence wouldn't have added anything meaningful to the occasion, and my absence didn't represent any remaining anger or resentment. It was simply an honest assessment of what our relationship had actually been. Jennifer called afterward to thank me for the flowers and to tell me about the service. It had been peaceful, she said, with speeches about Dad's work ethic and his love for his children. Michael had spoken about fishing trips and baseball games, memories that painted a picture of a father who'd been present and engaged during the good times. "I almost mentioned you in my speech," she said, "about how you turned out so well despite everything. But I wasn't sure if that would be appropriate." "Probably better that you didn't," I said. "Those kinds of tributes are for the living, not the dead." "Do you ever regret how things worked out?" "With all of us, I mean." "I regret that it had to work out that way," I said. "But I don't regret the choices I made in response to your choices." "That makes sense." "Besides," I added, "regret assumes things could have been different. But people do what they're capable of doing. You all did what you were capable of doing, and so did I. And you're okay with that?" "I'm better than okay. I'm complete." The conversation ended with something that felt like mutual understanding rather than resolution. We'd all become exactly who we were going to become, shaped by circumstances and choices that couldn't be undone or significantly altered. Accepting that reality had been more powerful than fighting it. Now, in my 60s, I look back on a life that turned out differently than anyone could have predicted during those foster care years. The abandoned child became the commander who saved others. The unwanted daughter became the officer who earned respect through competence rather than inheritance. The forgotten sister became the mentor who helped other forgotten children find their own paths to success. The story wasn't about revenge, though people sometimes interpreted it that way when they learned about my family background and military achievements. It wasn't about proving them wrong or making them regret their choices. It was about discovering that the approval I desperately wanted wasn't actually necessary for building a meaningful life. They'd taught me something valuable without meaning to, that love and loyalty can't be demanded or assumed, only earned through consistency. That family is something you build through daily choices rather than inherit through biology. That success tastes better when it's achieved for your own satisfaction rather than someone else's validation. The knock at my door that night after the 58 calls had been the moment when I finally understood my own power. Not the power to make them want me. I'd been trying that for decades without success, but the power to decide whether their sudden interest mattered to me. Standing at that door, key in hand, I'd realized that I'd already won the only victory that mattered, the ability to build a life that satisfied me regardless of who approved. They could knock forever, but I'd already moved beyond needing them to answer. The years that followed brought unexpected opportunities and challenges that tested everything I'd learned about independence and self-worth. When the Pentagon offered me a position as senior advisor on disaster preparedness, the role came with visibility that extended far beyond military circles. Congressional hearings, international conferences, television interviews discussing emergency management strategies. Suddenly my expertise was sought by people who made policy at the highest levels. The irony wasn't lost on me that the skills I'd developed through childhood abandonment, resourcefulness, adaptability, the ability to function without support systems, had become professionally valuable in ways no one could have predicted. Crisis management, it turned out, was something I understood intuitively because I'd been managing crises since I was 8 years old. During one particularly high-profile congressional hearing about national disaster preparedness, a representative asked about my background and what had prepared me for this kind of work. The question was meant to highlight my military credentials, but I found myself giving a more honest answer than anyone expected. I learned crisis management in foster care, I said. When your support systems are unreliable, you develop skills for operating under uncertainty. When resources are limited, you learn efficiency. When you can't depend on others, you learn to trust your own judgment. The comment was quoted in news coverage and military journals, sparking conversations about how childhood adversity could translate into professional competence. I began receiving speaking invitations from social work conferences and foster care organizations, groups that wanted to hear about resilience and long-term outcomes. These speaking engagements connected me with a community I hadn't expected to find, other former foster children who'd built successful careers despite difficult beginnings. Engineers, doctors, teachers, business owners, people who'd transformed their early experiences of instability into professional strengths. We shared an understanding of what it meant to succeed without safety nets, to achieve without family support, to build lives from nothing. One conversation particularly stayed with me. Dr. Maria Santos, a pediatric surgeon who'd aged out of foster care at 18, spoke about the unique perspective that childhood abandonment had given her. "We know what it means to be truly alone," she said. "So when we succeed, we know it's entirely ours. There's something powerful about achievements that can't be attributed to family privilege or inherited advantages." She was right. Every promotion, every recognition, every professional milestone belonged entirely to me because I'd earned it without assistance. The military had given me opportunities, but I'd had to prove myself worthy of them. Colleagues had offered support, but I'd had to demonstrate that support was warranted. Success felt clean and unambiguous because it was entirely self-generated. This led to meaningful work mentoring young people aging out of foster care, helping establish pathways to military training and education benefits. The program recognized that people who learn to function under difficult circumstances often possess skills that translated well to military service. Marcus had been in 12 placements since age 7. Brilliant but angry, he challenged everything I said about possibility. "Easy for you to say," he said. "You made it. But what about the statistics showing foster kids are more likely to be homeless, unemployed, in prison?" Those statistics describe what happens when society fails to provide support, not what happens when people find ways to support themselves, I replied. Marcus became a communications specialist, then ran his own consulting business while mentoring other foster kids. His success wasn't despite his background, it was because of how it had prepared him for challenges that stopped other people. These mentoring relationships gave me something I hadn't expected, a sense of family that was based on choice and mutual investment rather than biology and obligation. The young people I worked with chose to trust my guidance, and I chose to invest in their success. When they achieved milestones, their joy was genuine because they'd earned their accomplishments. When they struggled, their trust in my support was real because I'd proven my commitment through consistency. Watching them build lives they designed for themselves reminded me why the distance from my biological family had been necessary. Relationships based on guilt, obligation, and conditional acceptance could never provide the satisfaction that came from connections built on mutual respect and genuine care. The perspective shift was complete when Jennifer called to tell me that Mom had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. The progression would be slow, she explained, but eventually Mom would need full-time care. Jennifer was researching facilities and trying to coordinate with Michael about sharing responsibilities and costs. "I know you're not obligated to help," she said carefully, "but I wanted you to know what was happening." "Thank you for telling me," I said. "That must be difficult for you to manage." "It is. Michael's willing to help financially, but he lives too far away to be involved in day-to-day decisions. I'm trying to figure out how to handle everything while still taking care of my own family." There was an implicit request in her explanation, not for money, but for involvement. She was offering me the opportunity to participate in caring for our mother, to demonstrate the kind of family loyalty that our culture expected regardless of relationship history. I felt sympathy for Jennifer's situation and for Mom's diagnosis, but I didn't feel obligation. Mom had made choices about her relationship with me decades earlier, and I'd made choices in response. Her medical needs didn't retroactively create family bonds that had never been nurtured, didn't obligate me to provide care that she'd never provided to me. "I hope you find good solutions that work for your family," I said. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, processing my response. "You're not going to help, are you?" "I'm not part of that family unit," I said. "You, Michael, and Mom are. This is something for you to handle together. She's your mother too." "Biologically, yes. But she stopped being my mother in any meaningful sense when she chose Jennifer over me. Maternal relationships require ongoing investment from both people. We never had that. So you're just going to let her suffer?" "I'm not letting anything happen. I'm acknowledging that I'm not responsible for the consequences of choices I didn't make. You and Michael are her children in the ways that matter. You have relationships with her, history with her, emotional connections to her. Those relationships come with responsibilities that mine doesn't." The conversation ended with Jennifer frustrated and me feeling clear about my position. It wasn't cruelty, it was honest assessment of what our relationships actually were. I wished Mom well and hoped Jennifer would find manageable solutions, but those hopes didn't translate into personal obligation. 6 months later, Jennifer called with an update. Mom had been asking about me during lucid moments, wondering whether I was happy, whether she'd made the right decisions about our family. "She said she always knew you'd be okay because you were the strongest one of all of us," Jennifer told me. She said she worried more about Michael and me because we needed more help. The comment revealed that her choices had been based on perceived need rather than equal love. "Maybe that's true," I said. "But strength shouldn't disqualify someone from receiving care. She knows that now, I think. Too late to matter, but she knows." After Jennifer hung up, I found myself thinking about the complexity of family relationships and the ways that people could understand their mistakes without being able to fix them. Mom's late recognition of her failures didn't change anything practical, but it provided a different context for understanding her choices. She hadn't abandoned me because she loved me less. She'd abandoned me because she believed I needed her less. The calculation was still wrong, still harmful, still unforgivable in its impact. But the motivation was different than I'd imagined during all those years of feeling unwanted. Children shouldn't have to earn care by appearing needy, shouldn't have to compete for attention by seeming fragile. Strong children need love just as much as vulnerable ones, even if they're better at surviving without it. But understanding Mom's reasoning helped explain the pattern of behavior that had shaped our family dynamics for decades. This insight didn't change my decision about involvement in her care, but it added complexity to how I understood our history. She'd made choices based on limited emotional resources and flawed assumptions about what her children needed. The choices were still wrong, but they were comprehensible in ways I hadn't previously considered. The final chapter of my family story came 2 years later, when Jennifer called to tell me that Mom had died peacefully in the memory care facility where she'd been living. The funeral would be small, she said, just close family and a few longtime friends. Michael would speak about Mom's earlier years, when she'd been healthy and engaged. Jennifer would talk about her devotion to her grandchildren during the last decade. "Would you like to say something?" Jennifer asked. "About your memories of her?" "I don't think that would be appropriate," I said. "My memories wouldn't fit with the service you're planning." "What do you mean?" "You're celebrating her life and her relationships. My experience with her was different. It wouldn't be fair to either of you or to her memory to introduce that complexity during a funeral." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "You could talk about how she contributed to making you who you are." "She did contribute to that," I agreed. "But not in ways that would be comforting for people who loved her." I sent flowers again, with a card expressing sympathy for their loss. This time, I also wrote a separate note to Jennifer, acknowledging that losing a parent was difficult regardless of the relationship's complexities, and that I hoped she and Michael could find comfort in their positive memories. The gesture felt right: recognition of their grief without pretense about my own feelings, support for their experience without false claims about mine. It was honest in ways that family relationships rarely allow, clear about boundaries while still expressing care. In the weeks following Mom's death, I reflected on how completely my understanding of family had been transformed. The people who'd given me life had been largely absent from my actual living. The people who'd shaped my character and supported my growth had been chosen rather than inherited. The relationships that sustained me were built on mutual investment rather than biological accident. This wasn't a tragedy, it was simply a different story than the one our culture expects families to follow. Not all children are raised by their parents. Not all siblings maintain lifelong bonds. Not all family relationships survive the test of time and changing circumstances. These variations aren't failures. They're simply alternative outcomes that require different navigation strategies. The knock at my door that night after the 58 calls had represented a choice point that went beyond my relationship with my biological family. It had been a moment of deciding who I wanted to be, what kind of relationships I wanted to invest in, what standards I would maintain for how people could treat me. Standing there with the key in my hand, I'd chosen strength over sentimentality, boundaries over obligation, self-respect over family mythology. Those choices had led to a life that satisfied me completely, built around relationships that sustained rather than depleted me, structured according to my values rather than other people's expectations. They could knock forever, but I'd already found my way home. For years, I was the forgotten kid who still showed up, sending money, letters, and support to a family that left me in foster care. When they skipped my commissioning and got together without me, I chose something different: boundaries. This isn't payback, it's clarity. And what happened after I stopped rescuing the people who never rescued me might surprise you. If you've ever been used, sidelined, or treated like an afterthought, this story of stepping back and moving on is for you. Because the strongest kind of revenge? Peace. Thanks for being here.